Rob, thanks so much for taking the time today.
No problem at all. Thank you for having me on.
Well, listen, I'd love to start this conversation with you sharing with folks a little bit more about your background and your journey into your current role.
Sure, no problem. So, my kind of career as a sport and exercise scientist started at the University of Bath, where I did my undergraduate degree, finishing that in 2015. During that process, I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to spend a year in Canada, working as an exercise
Nice.
physiologist at the Peak Center for Human Performance. And then in my final year of the degree, I was also extremely lucky to meet Dr. Javier Gonzalez, and I know at the end of that year I was offered a PhD with him, staying at the University of Bath, where I've spent the last 4 years researching exercise and meal timing for health, and a focus of that work has been on sugar control, so blood sugar control, and also energy balance. I've been fortunate to work with some really excellent researchers, Professors Dylan Thompson and James Betts, Dr. Francis Kumanov, Dr. JP Weiland, all at the University of Bath, as well as researchers in Dr. Gareth Wallace at the University of Birmingham, and Professors Kevin Tipton and Emma Stevenson. So I've been very, very lucky in my PhD experience to be involved with some of these researchers, and I've learned a lot and managed to produce some research, which I think we're going to delve into today.
Yeah, no, that's phenomenal, and such a interesting topic and something that between athletes and general public, everybody is interested in and talking about and wondering the effects of, and of course, today with the general population obviously struggling with their health and metabolic health, weight gain, obesity, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease, all these types of things. And so, maybe a nice place to start is for you to give us a little recap on, energy balance and how it maybe relates to metabolic health to set up our discussion around some of the work that you've done.
Yeah, fantastic. I think it's a really great point to start, and I know some of your listeners will probably be quite familiar with this already. And I know my supervisor, Dr. Javier Gonzalez, also talked about this in one of your earlier podcasts.
Yes,
But it's always worth recapping some of
100%.
the basics. Yeah. So body weight over time is primarily dictated by energy balance, and energy balance is in some ways it's quite simple. It's the energy that we consume or we eat, which we call energy intake, and it's energy compared to the energy that you expend. And you can think of this as a weighing scales, if you like, or two sides of a scale. Energy intake would be the food and drinks that we eat. So in the diet, that's normally carbohydrates, fats, and protein, and also alcohol. And the slight caveat to that is you have metabolizable energy, which is the energy that we actually absorb from that food,
Hmm.
and the energy because we excrete a very small amount of energy, but typically only 3 to 5%. Energy expenditure on the other side, there's three main components. There's resting metabolic rate, which is the energy that we invest to stay alive. So you've got basic cellular functions, core body temperature. You've got diet-induced thermogenesis, which is the energy that we invest to metabolize, store, or oxidize the food that we eat. One example of that is the energy from protein. So quite a lot of energy from protein is wasted through heat loss, which is sometimes why you feel quite hot after eating, especially a very
All you can eat
protein-heavy meat,
buffet.
or a big barbecue on a sunny
Yeah,
day like
there you
today.
go.
And then the last component, which is something I've been quite interested in, is physical activity. And that can be exercise, but also activities such as fidgeting, walking to the shops. The really complicated thing is that these two factors are also interlinked. So your energy intake can affect your expenditure and vice versa. And we can probably discuss some examples relating to breakfast later on. But as researchers, we're often interested in capturing as much of information of these different components as we can.
I mean, it's a fascinating topic because, as you mentioned, when we look at it from 30,000 feet, we say this is quite simple. It's energy in versus energy out. We're trying to
Yeah.
lose weight. We simply need to take in less than we're expending. And yet, when we drill down deeper, there's all of these nuances that are impacting both sides of those equations. And as you mentioned, impacting one another. So maybe you can segue into discussing the work you did around the fasted versus fed exercise and how that impacted things like energy balance.
Yeah, so we know that for both energy balance and metabolic health, so metabolic health is well, if we quickly just have a think about that, and what we mean by metabolic health, and it's a term that's used to describe the ability of the body to maintain homeostasis of various substrates. So it's quite a broad term, and this can be from a whole body to a molecular level. The particular focus of my work was on blood sugar control, and I looked at this at a whole body level, but also in skeletal muscle. And we can talk about some of that research later on. But as you kind of mentioned right at the very start, it's important to remember that metabolic health is also very closely related to energy balance. So, for example, during weight loss, you'd expect many markers of metabolic health, such as your blood sugar control or your fat profile in blood, to also improve with weight loss. So these two things are very closely interlinked.
Yeah, I mean, it blew me away when I was chatting with Dr. Nicola Guest, maybe a year and a bit ago, around type 2 diabetes and how 90% of reversal is just due to weight loss. So it's a tremendous impact, isn't it?
Yeah, and we see this time and time again, and there's been some nice research at Bath that also demonstrates that relationship between energy balance and health. My research specifically, which is kind of where we were going with this, we know that for both energy balance and our health, exercise plays a role. It's widely recommended as a tool for people looking to manage their weight and to improve their health. We also know that exercise, if you like, dose, or the amount of exercise you do, and that's taken into account duration, intensity, frequency, that can be a primary determinant of the magnitude of many health responses to exercise training. So if you do more, you're likely to see greater improvements. But the problem we see today is that many people actually fail to achieve current physical activity guidelines, and quite often they say this is due to a lack of time.
Yeah, those 30 minutes, 5 times a week, right? We're getting into
Yeah,
that's the
if we look at
suggestion,
that,
and people say, well, geez, that's difficult to carve out if you're busy with work or kids or whatnot, right? Most, as you mentioned, fail to achieve that, don't they?
yeah, and we'll talk about the training study that I ran a bit later on. But a lot of my participants were from Bath, and typically they were parents, and they had young kids and a job, and they were trying to use the training study as well to kind of kickstart a bit more exercise for them and to improve their health. But it was that message: we haven't got time because we have kids and we have other commitments, which is where we were going. So any strategies to maximize the benefits of any exercise that is performed are likely to be really important. And I mean, the other kind of justification for this is there is evidence of some variability between people to the same exercise training for some health outcomes. And quite often this variability between people can also be greater than that of a control group, which suggests that it's actually true into individual variability. And yeah, we had some really interesting conversations with my supervisor, and like we know that we're quite good at studying nutrition and exercise, but at times maybe we can integrate these two disciplines a little bit more, especially when it comes to health. And yeah, that's the kind of setup for why we went into the research we did.
I was going to say, I mean, that's the perfect cohort to be working with. I mean, people who are time pressed and who really do want to have be able to uncover some of those potential marginal gains or significant gains from being able to structure food or exercise at different times. And of course, even, the psychological effect of actually seeing more of a shift in some of these markers or body weight. For a lot of people, they haven't seen that in a while. So yeah, curious to see what you guys found in the study.
Yeah, and that's it, exactly spot on. If you're going to do some exercise, why not? If there's a way you can get I like the term bigger bang for your buck. It's
Absolutely.
that's kind of what we were looking into.
Yeah, I mean, most people are used to doing a lot and getting very little results. So it's definitely appealing if they can do smaller amounts and get a bigger yield or bigger benefit in terms of
Yeah.
health and body composition.
Yeah, and especially when people are limited in the amount of exercise they feel they can do, then why not put in little places, little tactics to try and maximize those benefits?
100%. Can you walk us through how that was set up and what you guys uncovered?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm going to talk about a few studies that I completed throughout my PhD, and the first kind of study of my PhD was some mechanistic work. We were looking at metabolism during exercise, but my supervisor, Dr. Gonzalez, talked about that in season 2 of your podcast. So I'm not going to touch on that too much today. Instead, I'm going to talk about two other studies. One was an acute short-term study over a period of 24 hours that was primarily focused on energy balance, and we published that in the Journal of Nutrition. And then there was a longer-term exercise training study, which took up the majority of time of my PhD. We published that one in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism last year. And
Fantastic.
then at the very end, we can have a chat about a slightly different study that was also quite fun and interesting to do with energy balance as well.
Yeah, teaser maximal eating study. So make sure you stay tuned.
Yeah, definitely a fun one when we're all eating barbecues.
There you go.
So yeah, I guess we can maybe just delve into that acute study first around energy balance, if you'd like.
Perfect.
Um, so yeah, the acute study, we were basically looking at the effects of skipping breakfast and performing exercise compared to eating breakfast and doing the same exercise on the different components of energy balance that I talked about earlier. So why were we interested in this? Well, quite a lot of people would say they are a breakfast consumer, but there's lots of myths around this. Is eating breakfast good for your health? Is it bad? So, for example, if you survey people and measure their weight, if you're a breakfast consumer, you're typically less likely to be overweight. But you cannot necessarily say that's causal
Hmm.
from those observation studies, and there can be lots of different confounding variables. So the backdrop was a study completed by Professor James Betts at the University of Bath, where he randomized people to either eat breakfast or not, and he looked at different markers of energy balance. And what he showed in a nutshell was that the group that ate breakfast increased their physical activity across the day, and particularly in the morning. So the participants that skipped breakfast, they didn't seem to compensate by eating more later in the day, but there did seem to be a reduction in energy expenditure, which would, so if you were saying, well, I'll skip breakfast to lose weight, this reduction in energy expenditure, if we think back to those weigh-in scales, it would be eating into that energy deficit that they've created.
Yeah, it's fascinating how people wouldn't necessarily assume that and obviously just think, well, listen, I'm going to eat less total calories because I'm going to skip breakfast and therefore I'm going to be able to achieve this outcome that I'm after. But just as you mentioned, these things are interrelated, and all of a sudden now energy expenditure goes down, and our clients are still stuck in that same situation.
Yeah, and it really, you've hit the nail on the head there, because this reduction in energy expenditure, it wasn't it was through non-exercise activity, so things like fidgeting. Perhaps you're less likely to walk to the shops. Maybe those maybe subconscious movements or decisions you don't really think about. That's where these reductions in energy expenditure were coming from. So how did me and Javier talked about this, and we decided it'd be interesting to have an exercise condition in there. So this is what we set up in our study. We recruited 12 healthy, in this study, young men. They had a body mass index of 23, and they completed 3 trials in a randomized order. So in one trial, they arrived at our lab and we fed them a breakfast. It was a porridge breakfast, and they simply remained at rest. So that was our control trial.
Hmm.
In a second trial, they ate the same breakfast, but then they performed a bout of cycling exercise, and it was 1 hour at 50% peak power output. And then in a third trial, they actually skipped the breakfast, but still performed exercise. 2 hours later, we fed them a pasta meal for lunch, and then we provided them with a food package to eat outside of the lab. And all the meals they were allowed to eat as much as they would like from the lunch in the lab and from the food package. And we measured what was left over. And then we also measured their energy expenditure from expired gas samples in the lab. And then we looked at combined heart rate accelerometry outside of the lab, so we could measure energy intake and energy expenditure over 24 hours.
Terrific.
Yeah, and what we showed was that energy balance over 24 hours was unsurprisingly most positive in the rest condition. The men were in an energy balance state, so energy intake pretty much equaling energy expenditure in our breakfast and exercise trial.
Mm-hmm.
And in the skipping breakfast and exercise trial, the energy balance was minus 400 calories. So they were in an energy deficit. So that kind of is to be expected, given that they were in that energy deficit from breakfast. But the key message from that study was that due to the incomplete compensation for skipping breakfast before exercise, this strategy might create the conditions for greater losses in body mass compared to eating breakfast before exercise. So these men didn't seem to compensate for missing the breakfast by either eating more or doing less activity over this 24-hour period.
Such an important, fascinating findings, and so important from a practical standpoint, because this is a question that a lot of the general public wrestle with around that idea of waking up and getting some exercise in, and should I eat and shouldn't I eat? So really, really practical and insightful findings.
Yeah, the one caveat I would make to that is that it's important to remember with any acute studies like this that any changes in energy balance over a short period do need to persist over a prolonged period of time for changes in body mass.
Mm-hmm.
So we know that adjustments in energy intake to energy deficits from exercise are thought to be regulated over quite a long period. So to build on our work, what we now need is further research to investigate changes in energy balance and body mass with regular exercise training and skipping breakfast versus eating breakfast. Just to build on this and to see if this, you can think of our study as maybe the first step in answering that question, and we now need a training study to look at changes in body mass with skipping breakfast compared to eating breakfast and doing exercise. And it would really build on it as well, develop that study I talked about earlier from Professor James Betts around eating or skipping breakfast at rest.
And context is so important in this whole conversation, isn't it, Rob, in terms of the fitness levels of the individuals, or as you mentioned, the exercise intensity that they're training at, correct?
Yeah, 100%. So, and I think that is important to remember throughout, and I was going to link it in later as well, is that the research we talk about, especially with the training study, is moderate intensity endurance type exercise. So we're talking about maybe going for a run or going for a cycling in this study, and especially when we come on to talk about the training study and some of the adaptations there, and whether eating breakfast or not beforehand is appropriate, then I think definitely considering the type of exercise that's being performed, what your individual goals are, whether you're trying to improve your performance, whether you're trying to lose weight or improve your health, all of these factors need to be considered. And I think quite often we look for a black and white, one option fits every scenario answer.
Clients definitely look for that answer for sure.
Yeah,
It's like, just tell me the right answer. You're like, well, it's just all gray. It's not black or
that's
white.
science for you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Rob, could we segue into talking about how exercise impacts, insulin sensitivity, both, peripherally and, postprandially as well?
Yeah, 100%. And this is much more linked into our training study here.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll introduce the training study. What I wanted to do was give you because we also looked at energy balance in the training study. So I'll give you a quick overview of those findings while we're still talking about energy balance.
Awesome.
And then jump into the metabolic health and blood sugar control side of things.
Perfect.
So After the acute study that we did an exercise training study, and we recruited this time overweight or obese humans, and they were with me for 6 weeks at a time. And this study took the majority of my PhD, and it was about 2 years to complete. So it was a big project.
Yeah.
We actually got through 30 men. They were allocated to either a no exercise group, breakfast before exercise group, or a breakfast after exercise group for a 6 week study. The exercise groups completed 50 minutes of cycling, moderate intensity, 3 times a week, and they ate the same breakfast either before or after they did the exercise. So an important point here is we're now talking not about breakfast skipping, but about breakfast timing, which is another really interesting question. And we thought this was in a study with this population in terms of we were trying to make this quite a applicable study. We thought this change in breakfast timing would be the more interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
And we took lots of measures relating to their body weight, markers of body composition. But as you mentioned, we also completed something called an oral glucose tolerance test, which is where we gave the participants a sugary drink, which is about equivalent maybe 2 cans of Coke, and then we look at their blood sugar response and their blood insulin response to this kind of like a challenge, dietary challenge.
Mm-hmm.
And we also took muscle samples from the exercise muscle, and we worked with researchers in Poland and University College London, as well as at the University of Bath, to look at different measures. And while we're kind of giving you an overview of the study, we also looked at acute fuel use during exercise, working closely with a fantastic team of researchers at the University of Birmingham under the supervision of Dr. Gareth Wallace. So I'll loop back and discuss all of that in a moment, but just quickly kind of recap what we found in terms of energy balance. So remember, this is now breakfast timing rather than skipping breakfast.
Yep.
And we knew going into that study that regularly exercising in a fasted state and consuming breakfast after the exercise didn't seem to increase losses in body or fat mass over 4 to 6 weeks if you consume the same food after exercise. So there is some conflict in the literature, but quite inconsistent, and especially when it comes to meal timing. And what we showed in our study was that performing exercise, as you'd expect, it increased average daily physical activity energy expenditure compared to the control group. But there were no differences in self-reported energy intake, objectively measured energy expenditure, nor changes in body mass, waist to hip ratio, or any of these measures that we made between the 2 exercise groups. So this suggests that exercising before versus after breakfast might not create the conditions for greater losses in body mass if the same breakfast is consumed post-exercise. And on balance, this is what the literature suggests. For changes in body weight, exercise can be a really useful tool, but if we're just talking about meal timing around exercise, that doesn't seem to matter so much. But skipping breakfast and doing exercise, so that acute study, may be a useful strategy because you've created that negative energy balance, and performing that exercise there might help you to defend that negative energy balance. But there are more questions to answer on that front still.
I mean, it's such a great point around that idea of defending that energy balance, because as you mentioned before, people who don't eat breakfast typically aren't the fitter and leaner cohorts than the people who typically ate breakfast, as you mentioned earlier. But if we have this scenario where we fast and then exercise, you know, as you saw in your group there, we're not seeing this, rebound overconsumption of food throughout the day. Now, this is obviously can vary between individuals. But I think what you mentioned there, I think a lot of trainers or doctors listening in or practitioners, that idea of clients kind of struggling with, should I eat before, should I eat after? And yet we see if it's the same meal, it's not really going to have an effect one way or the other. And so it's not a question that people should be losing sleep over in terms of that timing issue, correct?
Not for energy balance, but there's some quite interesting findings that we have for health, and it's kind of how you started this section of the talk, and perhaps it's a good point to delve into that, what we found in terms of some of these health outcomes.
Yeah, and how the different substrates are being utilized. Perfect. Let's do that.
Yeah. So before we get into the kind of long-term adaptations, there is some really nice research around meal or nutrient exercise interactions for health. But before, kind of over the last year, these studies were mostly related to a single exercise session. And there's been some nice reviews in the area, and I'm happy to provide the links to those to the listeners if that's of interest. And we know that meal exercise interactions can influence acute metabolic responses to exercise. So we've known this for a long time. An example is for people with and without type 2 diabetes, the blood glucose response to a single meal can be lowered to a greater extent if you perform your exercise after compared to before the meal. And this is basically to do with increased oxidation or burning of the carbohydrates that you've eaten. So if you look at that acute studies, it could be suggested that you should perform moderate intensity activity between 30 to 120 minutes after eating carbohydrate-rich meals to help lower blood glucose peaks from that meal. So in theory, this might reduce cardiovascular disease risk if you repeated that stimulus after every single meal that was consumed. But caution should be taken when extrapolating any acute findings to longer term changes in health, especially when considering that the window over which exercise can affect blood sugar control can be up to 48 hours. So many post-exercise meals, not just a single one.
For sure. I mean, it's an interesting area because when you look at like offensive linemen or defensive linemen in American football or potentially similar positions in rugby, you get athletes who are overweight, but due to the amount of exercise, their metabolic profiles look great whilst they're playing. And then, because they're having that exercise and training repeatedly, as you just mentioned there, throughout the day. And then all of a sudden, upon retirement, when that activity goes down, then those metabolic profiles shift, pretty quickly.
Yeah, and it's another great example of the importance of exercise, and Dr. J.P. Warlen at University of Bath. Again, I'm kind of highlighting a lot of University of Bath. It's not all
you guys got a
research
great
done
group
there,
over there, so that's good.
I guess some of the talks the talks we have, and it is kind of linked into a lot of the work we've been doing. But he's done some work showing the power of exercise in that effect as well, and in protecting. In his study, it was against a big overfeed, and how exercise can protect some metabolic health even when you're in a positive energy balance. Performing exercise can stop some of the negative changes happening at a molecular level. So yeah, it shows the importance of being active and doing some exercise.
100%.
So jumping back in,
Yep.
that's the acute findings, especially relating to blood sugar control. But when we look at longer term studies, the picture isn't the same. So that might suggest you should do your exercise after a carbohydrate rich meal or some physical activity. But there was a study by Karen Van Proyen. It was in the Journal of Physiology in 2010. It's a really nice study, and it was kind of a pivotal study for setting up some of the work that we did. And in their study, healthy men consumed a high-calorie, fat-rich diet. So they were eating 30% above their normal, and I wouldn't call it high fat, but it was 50% of energy was coming from fat. And then they exercised for 300 minutes a week. So quite high exercise volume for 6 weeks. And they either had a carbohydrate-rich breakfast before, and then 1 gram per kilogram of body weight carbohydrate during exercise, or they exercised, fasted, and then they had the breakfast and additional carbohydrate after exercise. They had a control group, and relative to that control group, the blood sugar response to a sugary drink, so the same test that I talked about earlier, that decreased when exercise was performed in the fasted state, but not in the carbohydrate-fed state. And they also estimated insulin sensitivity, and they showed that also improved only if exercise was performed in the fasted state. So some really nice research there. It was a kind of a landmark study in this area, and showed that there might be some metabolic benefits of doing exercise in the fasted state.
Particularly when folks who are struggling with some of these metabolic conditions.
Yeah, so that study was in healthy people, which is why we wanted to kind of build on this a little bit more.
Amazing when we see it even in healthy people, right?
Yeah, and quite high exercise volumes there. The caveat was when exercising for health reasons and consuming large doses of carbohydrate as those in that study. So again, it was a carbohydrate-rich breakfast, and then also the 1 gram per kilogram during. It's not typical, whereas many people might exercise after having a carbohydrate-based breakfast. Lots of breakfasts in developed countries are carbohydrate-based, but maybe not necessarily also consuming carbohydrates during. And then, as you mentioned, that study was in healthy people, but feeding and fasting can exert different responses in people who are overweight compared to lean. And there's been studies that have shown that just fasting in the morning compared to consuming breakfast changes gene expression in some genes involved in fat turnover in the fat tissue or adipose tissue in lean people, but not in overweight or obese humans. So it's an example where we can't always extrapolate what's been shown in healthy people to people who are overweight. So in our study, we asked the participants to perform exercise before breakfast, and our breakfast was a carbohydrate drink, and I'll mention why we chose a drink in a second. And we showed that if you exercise before breakfast, so fasted, our measure of insulin sensitivity was increased relative to when the same exercise was performed after breakfast. So the same pattern, performing exercise in the fasted state led to greater benefits for insulin sensitivity. And in our study, the carbohydrate dose was lower. It was much more representative of breakfast consumed in developed countries in terms of the dosage, and there was no extra carbohydrate during exercise. And the 6-week intervention, as I mentioned earlier, it was 50-minute sessions 3 times a week. So it adhered to current physical activity guidelines, and we were recruiting the overweight or obese cohort.
Terrific.
Yeah, it was a very exciting finding, and it was nice to see that it kind of matched onto some of that earlier findings, and it kind of got us thinking about why this might occur, and I think that's always important in science, is to kind of delve into the mechanisms, and that's what we wanted to do with this study, which is why we took those muscle samples. So I can tap into a little bit of that if you'd like.
Absolutely, yeah. Let's dive into that.
So I think to understand some of the differences between exercise and the fasted or the carbohydrate-fed state, it's important to first think just about adaptations to exercise more generally. So apologies if this is recapping some of the basics for your listeners, but I think it's always useful to cover those basics before we talk about more specifics.
100%.
So the beneficial effects of exercise for health can be attributed to 2 main effects. So firstly, exercise increases our energy expenditure and acts as a potent acute stimulus for increasing muscle glucose and fat uptake. And that's basically to satisfy the energy demands of the exercise. So if we think of blood sugar control, each bout of exercise activates pathways in exercising muscle, which move the glucose transporter, which is a protein called GLUT4, to the plasma membrane to basically allow sugar to move from the blood into the muscle. And this is largely due to the activation of a really important protein called AMP activated protein kinase, AMPK. And this triggers some downstream proteins important in that cascade. And so we have this acute effect, but secondly, regular exercise not only increases the amount of time that we spend in this acute phase, but it also induces some long-term adaptations across many tissues that are also important for metabolic health. One example is each bout of exercise produces a short burst in gene expression of different key proteins, one of which is a protein called PGC1 alpha. And with subsequent bouts of exercise, if you keep the intensity the same, the magnitude of these bursts in gene expression might be diminished, but you get a build-up in the protein content of different proteins, for example, PGC1 alpha. And what will happen then is that will trigger some downstream adaptations, for example, changes in protein content of mitochondrial proteins. And I kind of mentioned it earlier, but of the molecular mechanisms that are important in exercise adaptation, one of the really key proteins is AMPK, which is this fuel sensing enzyme.
Yeah, I was going to say
And
it's important for listeners to sort of understand that idea of being a sensor and being able to, the body's way of being able to appreciate whether there's additional fuels on board or not, and that these get released, and then from there we're getting changes in terms of what fuels are going to be oxidized for a fuel source, right?
yeah, and spot on. It's one of the things that actually I love about physiology, and why I got involved with studying and researching it. Is just how and the more you study, the more you realize that the human body is very, very intricate, and it has all these systems in place. For example, if we talk about AMPK, it's a fuel sensing enzyme. It alters metabolism during and post exercise. For example, it increases muscle glucose or sugar uptake and glycogen synthesis by activation of a protein called AS160, and also increases lipid oxidation by a different protein called ACC. So all these different pathways going on, and you have different proteins triggering different pathways, and in a manner that's kind of sensitive to in our conversation, the nutrient status as well. With endurance type exercise, which again, this is what we're talking about here, running and cycling, you're always going to be burning a mixture of carbohydrates and fat as a fuel. And since at least 1920, there was a nice study by Croft and Linhard, with the first authors in 1920. We have known that meal timing, so when you eat in relation to exercise, alters metabolism. With running and cycling exercise, in the fasted state, there is an increase in fat oxidation and a decrease in carbohydrate oxidation. So when we eat breakfast prior to exercise, you get this increase in carbohydrate oxidation, and that's coming from an increase in blood glucose, but also muscle glycogen. Some studies have shown a muscle glycogen sparing effect with carbohydrate ingestion before and during exercise, but with modest doses of carbohydrate, which is what we're talking about here, that doesn't always seem to be the case. And so for clarity, when I'm talking here, I'm mainly referring to endurance type exercise at around about 40 to 60% VO2 max. Because as you increase the intensity of exercise beyond that, into what we'd start talking high intensity exercise, you start to increasingly utilize carbohydrate as the fuel, irrespective of whether the exercise is in the fed or fasted state. And again, some great researchers in this area, Bergman and Brooks, had a study, I think it was in the Journal of Applied Physiology, that demonstrated that really nicely.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a fascinating area because, again, this idea of fitness level is one that's, we clients, oftentimes we always want to think of ourselves as athletes, and of course elite athletes are a different level than even recreational elite athletes. And when we talk about the fuels that need to go into whether it's training nutrition or race day nutrition, it can be troublesome for recreational clients because they want to be fueling with, let's say, more carbohydrate to be able to elicit some of these gains. Yet, if we talk about body composition, they're not seeing some of these reductions in body weight or even improvements in some of the metabolic profiles there. So can you touch on your experience with working on the elite side, working with the general population? Are there some general recommendations or heuristics that you might give folks who are trying to lose 20 or 30 pounds versus those who are pushing more at the elite level and need to really fuel those training sessions?
Yeah, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head right at the very start when you said context is key, and that's what we're talking about here. So I think the two paradigms are very different. So for weight loss and for improvements in health, I think we kind of touch it at the very start that energy balance is very important. And there's some nice work, I think done by Susan Jebb, has looked at different, for example, different diets, so low carbohydrate, high carbohydrate, low fat, and the key seems to be energy balance. So if you can maintain a diet and maintain an energy deficit, weight loss will come in the long term, and improvements in health will also come. In terms of performance, I mentioned I'd done some work at the Peak Center for Human Performance in
Hmm.
Canada. So I worked a little bit with, in that context, it was with aspiring ice hockey athletes, but also some endurance athletes. And again, I think it's context. So if we're talking about long distance or high intensity performance, then certainly your fueling would be different to if you're going out for a 30 to 40 minute jog and your aim is just to recreationally run or cycle to improve your health. And there, I think we can start thinking about the demand of each session, which I think is the key really to knowing and to having an awareness of if your session is going to be greater than 2 hours, you might start seeing muscle glycogen depletion. So it's important to think about carbohydrate fueling. If the session is going to be high intensity, again, you might want to think about some carbohydrate fueling. But if you're just going for a run or a cycle and you're trying to improve your health, then glycogen depletion at moderate intensity exercise, where you might get muscle glycogen depletion leading to fatigue, that's not going to happen for a couple of hours. So your body can perform in this moderate intensity zone in the fasted state. So and I'll kind of touch in a second here. You might get some enhanced adaptations from performing that session in a fasted state.
Yeah, talk to us a bit about how those intramuscular triglycerides start to impact the story around, what substrates we're going to utilize during exercise.
Yeah, so before I jump into intramuscular triglycerides, if we link back to some of those key energy sensing proteins,
Hmm.
and these were some of the things that we measured in our muscle samples from the training study. So we know that AMPK and PGC1 alpha, some of those key ones I talked about earlier, they're nutrient sensitive, and they're involved in different adaptations, so mitochondrial adaptations, proteins involved in glucose or sugar transport into muscles, such as GLUT4, which is that main glucose transport protein. And in our study, we observed greater increases in the protein levels of AMPK and PGC1 alpha in muscle with exercise before versus after breakfast. So skeletal muscle AMPK, it can be activated by high fatty acid availability, as well as muscle glycogen availability. So some of the work that came before our study had shown quite nicely that when you exercise with low muscle glycogen, you can increase the responses of some of these proteins such as AMPK. So as I mentioned, our exercise training study was conducted in collaboration with researchers, including Dr. Gareth Wallace, and we looked at muscle glycogen as well as intramuscular triglyceride use with a single bout of fasted fed exercise. And we didn't observe any difference in muscle glycogen utilization with exercise before versus after breakfast. So we think the
Interesting.
increases in GLUT4 will probably be coming from increases in fatty acid availability and oxidation, leading to increases in skeletal muscle AMPK. We also looked at the phospholipid composition of skeletal muscles. These are, and this was done with researchers in Poland. It's the fatty acid composition of muscle membranes, and this has been important for health and insulin sensitivity. And we showed greater remodeling or beneficial remodeling of this membrane with exercise before breakfast. And then you mentioned as well about IMTG, and there's a nice body of evidence that's gone before us that suggests that turnover of fat stores might be beneficial for health. So that's the turnover of fat stores from our fat tissue, but also regular utilization of the fat stored in muscle, so intramuscular triglycerides, and this has been associated with improved insulin sensitivity. And in our study, because we collaborated with those researchers at the University of Birmingham, we were able to show that eating breakfast before versus after breakfast, exercise, sorry, say doing your exercise in the fasted state, you get increased intramuscular triglyceride utilization in type 1 and type 2 fibers of these overweight men. So overall, the mechanisms seem to point towards increased fat use with exercise in the fasted state being important for these changes in the health of muscle. Key proteins such as AMPK and GLUT4 being upregulated, changes to the fat composition of muscle membranes, and as you mentioned there, an increased turnover of the fat stores themselves. And a really nice element of our study was that we we measured expired air samples during every single exercise training study session. So we collected something called Douglas bags, and we looked at the composition of those bags, and we were able to work out energy expenditure and carbohydrate and fat use during every single session. And what we found is there was a correlation between the men who burned the most fat during the exercise training sessions and the change in our estimate of insulin sensitivity. So it again
Tremendous.
supports that idea that there's still a lot more mechanistic work to be done. It's a really exciting area, but the evidence from our study certainly points towards the burning more fat during exercise may hold the benefit to unlocking some of these health benefits.
Well, it's such compelling work when we think about the amount of people who pursue, endurance goals for better health, running a half marathon, running a marathon, and unfortunately, the amount of people who, despite ramping up their exercise expenditure tremendously, don't lose all that much weight over the course of their 2, 3, 4, 5 months of preparation. And this is where the fueling strategies become so important, and to be able to see that, particularly if they need to be doing more aerobic work and spending 80% of their time with truly aerobic sessions, being able to do that first thing in the morning, without having to, have any fuel on board is not only convenient, but as you're alluding to with all and you've proven in your research, is a great way to start improving that metabolic profile.
Yeah, and although some of the research we've been doing is quite new in terms of looking at this for health, and it's important to acknowledge there's been a lot of great research already done in this area. Louise Burke, John Hawley have done work, Catherine de Bock, I mentioned Karen Van Proyen's study, James Morton, they've all done great work in this area, and typically looking at this from kind of adaptations to exercise, typically with higher exercise volumes, often with a performance outcome,
Yes.
Rather than looking at it from health. So there was a lot of nice work, and some of those studies also point to that there might be some enhanced adaptations to performing exercise in the fasted state, looking at proteins such as AMPK, some of the mitochondrial proteins being upregulated. Whether that always translates into increases in performance, the evidence is a little more unclear. We definitely see some enhanced adaptations. Doesn't always translate into improved performance, which is another thing to acknowledge here, is that you need that complete picture. You need the adaptations and then the final outcome.
Absolutely, yeah. On the performance end, obviously, that training nutrition, and as you mentioned before, sort of what the demands are of the session, and being able to then strategize and plan what type of fueling strategy you want to take on board to really get the result that you're looking for.
Yeah, and it's something, again, I think we should reiterate here. And my background is definitely more on the health side of things, but from performance, obviously, I'm interested in that element as well. And increasingly, when you talk to the guys that are involved with elite athletes, we're not talking about always training in the fasted state or always training with carbohydrate, but instead, I think it's thinking about, well, what do I need to fuel this exercise session? Is this going to be a long exercise session where I need to be thinking about carbohydrate, or is this an easy, moderate intensity ride where perhaps I don't need to take on as much fuel because I can increase some of these adaptations from performing the session fasted, and again, also thinking about energy balance. So you need to be thinking about this holistic picture rather than black and white, always perform exercise in the fasted state. I think there's definitely a time and place to it, and this kind of moderate intensity running, cycling is again where we're talking about with this.
Real sweet spot, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. And Rob, if we look at sort of the evolution of research in this area, what are some areas that you think in the next 5 or 10 years will be on the cutting edge, or areas that we might find some more gains?
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting area to be involved in, and kind of we hinted at the start, like we're very good at looking at exercise, especially when it comes to health. We're very good at looking at nutrition, but these interactions are so exciting, and I think it could help us, like we said, get the bigger bang for a buck, which in today's climate, I think is where it is. And in terms of next steps, so for various reasons, we conducted our research in men. I think there's some work that needs to be done to repeat that in women. I think we talked about, when we were talking about the adaptations, that we think it's to do with increased fat burning. And what I would say is that the sex, really, you get the same effect where men or women perform the exercise in a fasted or a carbohydrate fed state. You'll get increased fat burning irrespective of sex. But it's one very easy question that could be answered. I think then we can start getting into some of the nuances, like is there a minimal number of sessions that need to be performed fasted? What about changing the meal composition? If you say you really want to perform some exercise fasted, but your job doesn't allow you to exercise in the morning, perhaps you could skip lunch or have a low carbohydrate lunch and perform your exercise before dinner. So you're still performing your exercise in a without having a large dose of carbohydrate beforehand. So lots of questions to be asked around there, and I know there's also some really nice research going on around the timing of exercise throughout the day. So Brendan Gabriel and Julian Zareth are doing some nice work around timing of exercise across the day, and I think that's also kind of an exciting area to tap into now.
Absolutely, it's great for people to know that they're not. There's not necessarily one better time, or maybe we'll find out that there is one better time. But as you mentioned with timing of meals, if lunch, if you want to train after lunch, then there's strategies where we can start to alter carbohydrate availability at lunch to then facilitate some of those gains. And so, we can work around client schedules and,
That's it, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, working in men's health for the last 20 years, I mean, I think it's a big one definitely for men in particular, to be able to try to fit it into their schedule. Because unfortunately, if it doesn't, then they're going to adopt strategies that maybe we don't want them doing. And so practicality is a big part of that. And it's tremendous to see all the great work that you've done. And if people want to stay connected with you, Rob, and keep up with your work, where can they best keep in touch with you?
Yeah, so on Twitter it's r dash Edinburgh 93. My university email address is r.m.edinburgh@bath.ac.uk, and I'm happy to answer any questions that have come about from the talk. And yeah, in terms of kind of summing up what we've said, I think that the key message to leave on is when we're talking about health, like any diet or exercise routine, the main determinant of long-term benefits is persistence. So find a routine that works and stick at it. But if you can go in the morning, you might be getting some additional benefits from exercise, and it's also a great time to be out and about. It's normally quite quiet, which is probably quite beneficial in our current climate. It's the morning is a great time. And why not? If you're going to get a bigger bang for your buck, why not?
Exactly. I think that's a great, two great points there, especially around sticking it out, because I think everybody wants all the success in the first 4 or 8 weeks, and so sticking it out is a great point to encourage that compliance factor being a great predictor of success. And hey, first thing in the morning, like you said, bigger bang for your buck. Most people will want to take that up, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's I think when it comes to weight loss and when it comes to improving your health, and even when it comes to exercise performance, it's quite often it's a marathon and not a sprint. It's finding something that works for you, and if that's diet, or if that's an exercise routine, something you can stick at, and that should be the key message. But the research we're doing at Bath really does seem to suggest that the meal timing is going to play an important role. And if you can at least do some of the sessions in the fasted state, you might expect to see some increased health benefits from that.
Tremendous, Rob. Appreciate the time. Thanks so much for coming on.
No worries at all. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you.